The sea lay calm beneath the soft veil of dawn, its waves rolling gently like the slow breathing of a slumbering giant, and the longship of the Northmen drifted upon that silver expanse as though the winds themselves had chosen mercy. There was no roar of battle, no clang of iron, only the rhythmic creak of wood and the whisper of the oars cutting through the water. For these men had set forth, not in conquest, but in quiet seeking, their hearts stirred by questions that neither sword nor shield could answer. The sky stretched wide above them, pale and unbroken, and the gulls wheeled lazily in the distance, as if guiding them toward a shore unknown. Among them was Haldric, a man once fierce in raid and storm, his beard touched by frost and his eyes lined with years of salt and smoke. Yet now those eyes were softer, watching the horizon with a longing that no treasure could satisfy. He remembered the villages burned, the cries of the vanquished, the hollow feasts that followed, and he wondered in the stillness if the gods of his fathers had grown weary of blood, or if it was his own soul that had tired of the endless wheel of gain and loss. The others spoke little, their voices hushed as though the sea itself had bid them keep their peace, and in that silence they began to hear the echo of their own hearts, a sound more subtle than the drum of war, but deeper than any horn's call. Days passed in that manner, the sun rising and setting like a patient teacher, and the winds carried them farther from the fjords of their birth toward lands where the language was foreign and the stars seemed to sing with another tune. At night they sat beneath the swaying mast and watched the constellations wheel slowly across the firmament, their breaths forming pale ghosts in the chill air, and spoke in murmurs of dreams they could not name. One dream came again and again to Haldric, a river of light winding through a valley of sand, a voice calling not in the tongue of the north, but in a melody that felt older than winter, a promise of rest after the long storm. He did not share it at first, fearing the laughter of his kin. Yet as the nights grew longer and the shore still hid itself, he found others had seen the same river, the same strange glow, the same voice that asked, not for offering of gold or blade, but for the bowing of a weary head. It was thus that when the first minaret pierced the horizon, its silhouette rising like a finger pointing heavenward, they felt no urge to plunder, only a quiet pull as though their voyage had found its breath. The city that awaited them was unlike the stone halls of their homeland. White walls gleaming in the sun, markets humming with the low murmur of prayer and trade, the scent of spice and sand blending with the salt that still clung to their cloaks. No spears barred their way, for they came with empty hands and curious eyes, and the people watched them not with hatred, but with a wary respect. For travelers carried stories, and stories were seeds. Haldric walked among them, and felt the weight of his axe lighten upon his shoulder, as though it too had grown tired of the old songs. They were shown a place to rest, a courtyard, where water whispered over carved stone, and there they learned of a faith that spoke of one God, merciful and mighty, who weighed the heart more than the blade, who forgave the wanderer and welcomed the stranger as brother. It was not the clash of creeds that touched them first, but the stillness in the air. When the call to prayer rose, a sound unlike the roar of battle horns, a note that did not demand, but invited. They listened as the muezzin's voice drifted across the tiles, and found that their own breathing slowed, their hearts beating not with the urge to conquer, but with a strange ease, as if the sea that had carried them now lay within their chests, calm and wide. Days turned to weeks, and their names were spoken in the markets not as raiders, but as guests, and the children followed them with laughter rather than fear. Haldrick began to rise with the dawn, not to sharpen his blade, but to walk among the palms, his fingers tracing the cool water of the fountains. And in that reflection, he saw a man he had not known, not the wolf of the north, but a traveler standing on the edge of a new shore. He spoke with scholars who told him of mercy greater than vengeance, of strength found in patience, of a path where a man might lay down the burden of his past and not be lessened, but made whole. At night, he lay beneath the unfamiliar stars and whispered to them, not in the old chants of his forefathers, but in simple words that felt like the first steps of a child upon clean snow. His companions, too, began to change, their laughter no longer edged with cruelty, but with warmth, their feasts not drowned in mead, but shared in quiet gratitude. Some shaved their beards, some washed their hands before meals, and some sat long in the courtyards, listening to the recitation of verses they did not yet understand, but which stirred the same river light in their dreams. The people called them seekers, and the name felt truer than warrior or trader, for they had come across the sea not for gold, but for something that could not be carried in a chest. And though the journey was far from its end, and the old ways clung to them like the scent of smoke upon their cloaks, there was a softness in their steps now, a gentleness in the way they spoke to the merchants and the beggars, as if some hidden frost within them had begun to thaw. The sun rose each morning over the domes and slender towers, painting the walls with gold and rose, and the Vikings, once restless and swift to depart, found themselves lingering as though some unseen thread held them there. The markets became familiar, the scent of cardamom and baked bread no longer foreign, and the rhythm of the city began to weave itself into their own hearts. Haldrick often walked the narrow streets at dawn, when the stones still held the cool breath of night, and listened to the distant call that summoned the faithful to prayer. It did not strike like the clash of shield and sword. It flowed like a river through the veins of the city, and he found that his own steps slowed when he heard it, his grip upon the axe loosening until his fingers merely rested upon the worn leather of the handle. The warriors who had once drunk deep of mead and roared at the stars now shared bowls of dates and cups of sweet water, their laughter quiet, but no less sincere. They were men accustomed to conquest, yet here no banners fell, no walls burned, and still they were welcomed. The people did not demand that they kneel nor press coin into their hands. They offered stories, smiles, and patient answers to the questions the Northmen dared to voice. What is strength, one asked, if not the power to forgive? What is honor, another wondered, if not the keeping of one's word when no one is watching? They spoke with scholars in shaded courtyards where fountains whispered, and learned of a path where discipline was not a chain, but a key, where submission was not defeat, but release, where one could wash away the stain of past bloodshed with deeds of mercy and a heart turned toward the one who created the wind and the wave alike. Haldrick found his nights restless, though not with fear. Dreams came to him like tides, gentle yet insistent, showing him fields without end where no swords clashed. Only voices murmured in remembrance of the divine. He woke with the taste of salt upon his lips, though no storm had touched their harbor, and he felt as though some hidden burden had shifted within him, not gone, but lighter. The others too changed in small, quiet ways. One laid aside his blade for a day to help mend the sails of a merchant. Another returned a coin he might once have kept. A third sat for hours beside a sick child, speaking softly, though he did not know the tongue. The people watched and whispered, for they had seen raiders turn to traitors before. But rarely had they seen wolves, learning the patience of shepherds. There came a night when the sky burned with stars, as bright as frost upon iron, and the Vikings gathered upon the rooftop of their lodging to watch the city sleep. No feast, no plunder, only the hush of wind over stone. Haldrich spoke then, his voice low, telling them of the river in his dreams and the voice that had called to him before ever they sighted this shore. Others nodded, some with eyes distant, for they too had felt the same pull, the same subtle hand turning their hearts from the clang of war to the quiet of reflection. One asked, "What if this is the path we were meant to find? Not the halls of endless feasting our fathers promised, but a peace that begins before the grave?" No one laughed. They sat long in that silence, the stars turning slowly above, and when the call to prayer rose at dawn, more than one of them found himself standing still, not from fear, not from command, but because the sound seemed to reach into some ancient part of their being that had always yearned for order amidst the storm. Days stretched into months, and the longship remained in its mooring, its sails furled like folded wings. They learned to wash their hands before meals, to pause in their dealings, to lower their voices when the old imam passed, and each small act seemed to polish some hidden metal within them, as though their souls were shields, long tarnished, now catching the first true light. Haldrich visited the great library of the city, its halls cool and echoing with the scent of parchment, and there he read words older than his homeland, words that spoke of one Creator, of mercy greater than vengeance, of patience stronger than steel. He carried those words back to his companions, not as orders, but as gifts, and they turned them over like stones in their hands, weighing them, testing their truth. No thunder split the sky, no miracle turned their ship to gold, but a calmness grew among them, like spring beneath melting snow. They still bore the scars of raids, still woke at times with the old hunger for battle in their blood, but it was met now by another hunger, one that no feast could fill, the hunger to be clean, to be forgiven, to stand at the end of their days and say they had become more than the fear they once sowed. The turning came, not with a clash of signs, nor with a voice of thunder, but with the slow and steady settling of the heart, like a ship finding calm waters after months of restless sea. It was in the quiet hours before dawn that Haldrich felt the weight of his years gather upon his shoulders, and then, as though some unseen hand had lifted it, begin to fall away. He rose from his sleeping mat and walked to the courtyard, where the fountain murmured softly, its waters lit by the pale stars that still clung to the sky. The city stirred faintly, a whisper of footsteps in distant alleys, the faint aroma of bread rising in hidden ovens, and when the call to prayer echoed once more across the tiles, he did not merely pause to listen. He felt his chest open, his breath deepen, his hands rise not in defiance but in surrender, to a peace he could not name, yet knew to be true. That morning, he sought the counsel of the imam who had spoken with them often, a man whose beard was white as mountain frost, whose gaze held no judgment, but a patience that had weathered many seasons. They sat together upon the cool stone and spoke for a long while, not of conquest or tribute, but of forgiveness, of what it meant to wash the past from one's soul, to begin again, not as a wolf, but as a man among men. Haldrick asked if such a thing were truly possible, if the scars upon his hands, the smoke upon his breath, the memory of blades in the night, could ever be cleansed. The Imam smiled and told him that the sea itself had swallowed greater storms, that the mercy of the Creator was vaster than the fjords from which he came, that the door of return was never closed to one who knocked with a sincere heart. And so, in the days that followed, the Vikings came not as raiders, nor as mere guests, but as seekers, ready to leave behind the weight they had carried too long. One by one they bathed in the waters of the courtyard, the coolness of the stone beneath their feet, grounding them as they whispered the words taught to them, words that did not demand they forget their ancestors, but that they turn their hearts toward the one who had fashioned both ice and fire. It was not a single act, but a series of steps, each one a letting go, of grudges held like rusted blades, of oaths sworn in anger, of the pride that had once driven them to sail endless coasts in search of glory that never fed the soul. Haldrick found that his dreams grew lighter. The river of light now led to a garden where the air smelled of rain and the voices spoke not of war, but of remembrance. His hands, once stained with the ash of burning halls, now poured water for travelers in the market. His companions learned to bow their heads in gratitude before they ate, to greet the dawn not with curses at the cold, but with a murmur of thanks for the breath still in their lungs. There were moments of doubt, for the old ways lingered like ghosts in the corners of their minds. The roar of the hall, the promise of a warrior's afterlife, the pride of their fathers' names. Yet each time doubt rose, they found it met not with scorn, but with patience. The scholars did not mock their questions, the children did not flee their scars, the faithful did not demand gold for guidance. They were simply shown the path, and the path was wide enough for weary feet. When the month of fasting came, they joined in, unsure at first, their stomachs protesting, their hands restless. But as the days passed, they found a strange clarity, a quiet strength that no mead had ever given. The nights were filled with soft lamps and shared bread, the mornings with cool air and whispered remembrance, and they began to see the world not as a field to conquer, but as a trust to guard. Haldrick kept a small book of verses near his bed, though his tongue stumbled over the words, and each night he traced the lines with his fingers as though feeling the grain of a new shore beneath them. His heart no longer beat with the urgency of a raider, but with the steady pulse of a man at anchor, content to learn, to listen, to grow. And in that transformation there was no loss of strength, only its redirection, as a river once wild becomes a channel that waters the land. When the seasons turned, and the winds once more bent the branches toward the sea, the Northmen knew that their journey could not remain forever in the lands of sun and minarets. Their ship, long patient in the harbor, had grown a cloak of salt and silt along its hull, yet its timbers still yearned for the open water. They had arrived as warriors, cloaked in the smoke of old raids, but now they gathered upon the quay as men changed by the slow, gentle force of truth. One by one, in the weeks before their departure, they came to the courtyard where the fountain sang and the Imam waited with the same calm gaze he had worn from the first day. There, with the city's dawn rising behind them, many placed their hands upon their hearts and spoke the words they had learned, the simple testimony that had lingered on their tongues like dew upon morning grass. There is no God but the one, and Muhammad is his messenger. The words did not strike them like thunder. They settled like rain upon parched earth, soaking deep, stirring seeds that had long lain hidden beneath the frost of pride and bloodlust. Haldrick was among the first to speak it aloud, his voice rough yet steady. And when he did, it was as if the weight of every hall burned, every raid cried over, every face lost to the blade, lifted from his shoulders and drifted out over the still water of the fountain. Others followed, some with tears they did not try to hide, some with trembling breath, some with silent resolve, and the city bore witness, not with banners or trumpets, but with the simple, enduring patience it had always offered them. In the nights that followed, their camp upon the shore glowed with the soft light of oil lamps, and the air was filled not with boasts of conquest, but with recitation, with whispered prayers, with the measured breath of men learning a rhythm older and steadier than the clash of swords. When at last the day came to leave, they loaded their ship not with stolen gold, but with gifts freely given. Dates wrapped in palm leaves, flasks of water drawn from the cool well, books of scripture that they would guard like treasure. The city bid them farewell with smiles and blessings, and as the tide bore them northward, they looked back to see the minarets receding like white birds upon the horizon. The voyage home was long and marked by storms, yet there was a calm in their hearts that no wave could overturn. They prayed upon the deck when the stars wheeled above them. They washed their hands with melted snow. They spoke to one another not of vengeance, but of what they might build when they returned. When at last the fjords opened to greet them, their kin saw not the wild-eyed raiders who had left, but men of quieter gaze, their armor softened by travel, their voices carrying a new steadiness. At first, the elders asked what they had found, and the younger ones mocked the absence of plunder. But the words of the travelers were not boastful, only steadfast. They told of the one who made the wind that filled their sails and the sea that bore their keels, of the mercy that forgives even the hand that once wielded fire, of the path that does not demand gold, but sincerity. Some scoffed, yet some listened, and the winter that followed was filled with long nights of storytelling by the hearth. Children learned to trace the shapes of the letters, women heard of the fasting month and its nights of light, and a few among the chieftains sat with Haldrick beneath the cold sky and asked to hear again the words of the testimony. It was not a conquest. It was a returning, a seed sown in quiet earth. In time, more and more stood upon the rocky shores, and let the cold spray wash their faces as they spoke the Shahada, their breath rising like mist to the dark heavens, their eyes turned inward as much as outward. Villages that had once measured wealth by the weight of silver now measured it by the peace that lingered in their halls, by the fairness of trade, by the restraint of their warriors, who no longer burned what they could instead protect. The old gods did not vanish in a single night. Their names still lay upon the lips of some, their symbols carved in beams and stones. But a new rhythm began to weave among the people, one that taught them to bow before dawn, to give when none demanded, to seek forgiveness before they sought fame. Haldrick grew old beneath that sky. his beard whitening like the peaks above the fjord, and he found himself walking the paths of his youth with a heart unburdened. Where once he had raised his axe to claim what was not his, now he raised his hands to ask for mercy upon those who had not yet heard. In the quiet of his last winter, he sat by the sea and listened to the waves recite their endless praise. And he smiled, knowing that his people, once feared as wolves upon the coasts, had begun to learn the patience of shepherds. The saga of their raids would not be erased, but it would be followed by a saga of cleansing, of turning, of finding the true north, not in the star alone, but in the guidance of the one who made the stars. And so the fjords, once echoing with the clash of iron, learned a new music, the gentle murmur of prayers carried upon the wind, the sound of children reciting under low roofs, the sigh of waves upon a shore no longer hungry for war.